This is Monica Perez here with Mystic Mark of the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And we talked about a year ago, and I cannot tell you how much good feedback I got. You are truly a fan favorite, if not the fan favorite. I don't know if you knew that. I think, yeah, my audience is starving for mystical insights. They're not getting them from me.
Cool. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Thanks for having me back, Monica. And shout out to everyone in the audience who is awaiting my return. I had a lot of fun with our first 2 episodes. It was it was either a long episode that became a two-parter, or it was a short episode that I came back quickly to follow up with. But yeah, I
No,
noticed part
it was
one,
long.
part two, and that
Yeah.
was cool. And we've got some interesting things I think we could talk about today. So yeah, I'll let you take the lead.
Brad wants to know if you're a Nephilim. Well, Brad says that you're a Nephilim. Are you really 8'6"?
Oh, God. Yeah, somebody's like me and has dyslexia. No, I'm 6'8".
Are you really? That's like too tall. It's hard to be too tall, but it's a little too tall.
Yep, I'm in the professional sports,
Yes.
height cat range. Like, I can't avoid the basketball questions.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that must be so
So it's
so
fun. No, it's a good icebreaker. I've learned to take it as a chance to tell people what I actually am interested in, so it's not bad.
there you
I don't
go.
mind it. Yeah.
Wow, I did not know. It's very yeah, the it goes off the charts like how few people hit that height.
Oh,
You know what I mean? Like it's 2 standard deviations and the tail, it has to get
oh, yeah.
very long before we get where you
Well,
are.
in a tale of irony, I'm the youngest in my family, and I'm also a junior. So and I'm also there's my cousin's name is Mark. So he's Big Mark, my dad's Uncle Mark, and I am Little Mark, even though I'm the youngest.
That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, I have a nephew who is one of the guys. So we were saying how, in our world, like the people who are your famous people, your favorite people,
Oh, yeah.
my mom doesn't know, didn't until I turned her on to Sam Tripoli. She didn't know who he was, but my nephews all know. So I have a nephew who's super tall. He loves Sam Tripoli, loves that whole gang, and he's little Georgie. And he's just probably the tallest one, and even
Well,
his
yeah.
baby mama calls him little Georgie. It's like
Oh, yeah? Wow.
it's
Well,
cute.
maybe there's some swagger there for little Georgie. I appreciate the Nephilim compadre out there, wherever he is, listening to Tinfoil Hat alongside of myself. So yeah, shout out to all the Nephilim out there. I don't claim any Nephilim lineage. I think it's just my genes. I think what it is people from the northern climates grow to taller heights because it's like an elevation adaptation. So I just have genes from the north. That's my best guess. And I think
It,
maybe it's not necessarily like geo position. It could also be like where if you're in a high altitude, so if you live in the mountains, you may be more likely to grow taller.
I've always thought, or I recently determined that in places I've been, southern places, I've been to Peru and South America a few times, and places where food just grows on trees. So I went deep in the jungle in the Amazon. I knew a missionary priest there, and it took us 5 hours to go up the Amazon, and you weren't allowed to go to the edges because he would defend them. He'd be like, "Yeah, they don't want you there, and if you trespass, you might disappear." And he's like, "You can't judge them for that." I don't blame, he was very non-judgmental towards them, but it was like scary.
Mm.
And when we got in there, the people just there was yucca, I guess there's like a drug that grows, and they just smash it up and chew it up and spit into the thing, and they just spend their entire time while I was there making this like kind of alcoholic beverage drug type thing and consuming it. And I was like, wow, people just want to everywhere at all times. People's default state is like, I would rather just be high, but mostly, we have to work so that we can't just sit around doing that. And they didn't, because food was just growing on trees. When they got hungry, they would just, and I think what a culture that will create if you don't have to, if it's hot all the time and the food
and the food
goes.
goes.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I like to think in those terms because I've always been interested in nature and biology. But as I've grown older, I'm starting to learn about, and as you talk about people just want to get high, I'm like rolling up over here. But
Yeah.
when it comes when it comes to like the way I've evolved over time to see the world, I've become a little bit more skeptical of a lot of the evolutionary explanations for things, but I still give a lot of play, for lack of a better term, to these kind of concepts because I think there are really well intending people in those fields, but then when they do the fact finding, it gets filtered up to this academic level that kind of fits it into the narrative wherever they can, and then the truth gets lost in that narrative. So now we live in this world where a lot of conspiracy theorists are like, space is fake, science is fake, right? And I don't necessarily take that approach. I'm like, well, yeah, space might be a lie, what we are told about the perimeters of our known realm maybe is a lie, but I still do think that there are plenty of reasons to use the scientific method, and I think there's plenty of valid scientific theories that we can
Uh-oh.
so like what we're going to be talking dream walking. I think it's important for people to keep that in mind as well, that I'm approaching this not necessarily from a sort of hippy dippy, take it all in by the seat of my pants kind of approach. It might seem like that the way I talk. I don't know. Maybe that's just my own insecurity. But when it comes to, the point you just mentioned, I don't know that yucca is the plant that you saw. It could be. It could just be the same name for a different thing.
Well,
To
it
my
wasn't the ayahuasca. It wasn't
knowledge,
like the super trippy one.
right? No, I think you might. I don't know if this is the guayuki is like a guayuki or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce it. I just only read it. And another name for it is like herba. So it could have been that because
Well,
that's
there's
more
yerba
you.
mate. There was that, which was like a stimulant that so you
Yeah.
would drink coca tea sitting at the coffee shops, which was great. Coca tea is so much better than regular tea or caffeine is nowhere near as good as cocaine. It's
Right.
like a much better stimulant. And of course, we're not allowed to have any of it, but they also did yerba mate is what they would
Right.
drink.
'Cause I thought
Ayahuasca
yucca
is the
was
trippy
like a
one.
potato starch.
Yeah,
That
the
had
yucca is the potato starch one.
maybe it's the coca leaves that they're chewing like that because that's a big that's a big one, is chewing the coca leaves. But either way, we don't need to get lost on details on the Amazon rainforest. That's just such a amazing place in my mind. I'd love to go there. So you started talking about it, and it really just got my imagination going because there is so much to learn from that place, and it does connect to some of the things that I was planning on talking about with Atlantis and these lost
Yeah, let's dig
civilizations.
in.
Well, the Amazon rainforest is, in many ways, evidence for an advanced civilization. Now, with LIDAR, they've determined that a lot of the rainforest was once not only inhabited, but with structures and entire city complexes that are now overgrown. The reason why they have overgrown at such a maybe expanded capacity is because the peoples in this civilization, however many years ago it was, had an advanced agricultural system that have you ever seen the show on History Channel where they do like the sh- you know predictions on what a city would look like 100 years into the future
Yes.
after humans? So this is, imagine like this happening 10,000 years ago to a civilization in the Amazon where now the Amazon River and rainforest is. um and then because they had such like a high nutritional soil quality, when their civilization collapsed, their farms overgrew and became this super abundant rainforest.
Yeah, I mean,
So
that's is what would happen.
right. So there's evidence for this in the form of like very rich soil samples that can only be found in that part of the world. And, I'm not by no means, someone who studies like soil quality, but from what I've read, this is evidence of human agriculture. You can't have this sort of high quality of soil admixtures just naturally. It just wouldn't occur that way. So, with that in mind, we need to rethink how long human beings have been on the planet. And there's plenty of evidence, growing for that. And as science evolves, and as excuse me, archaeology evolves, we'll start to account for more of this stuff. And our view of humanity and human history will become less narrow minded. But to bring it to kind of like the whole Atlantis thing, that's like what we all were given was a narrow minded view of Atlantis through Plato, and not necessarily through his own fault or his own like intention. Um, it seems like he was operating from a limited capacity of knowledge to begin with, because one of the stories that were told about Plato is that, or not about Plato, but from Plato, is that this story of Atlantis came to him from, one person after another, right? His, friend of a friend of a friend type situation. And according to this story, Solon, this great priest, was speaking to someone named Dropides, and he was telling them, you Greeks, you don't understand how long, our records go back, because every time your civilization collapses, you lose all your information and have to start over. He's like, we have everything recorded, right? I'm paraphrasing, but this is
Yeah.
essentially what the Egyptians said to the Greeks, right? And I think we're kind of in a similar position right now as modern, in our modern world with science and technology. We have this kind of hubris of, well, we've figured it out and we've progressed so far, yet we're also kind of on the brink of maybe like a manufactured collapse as well, like constantly. I don't know if it's like a carrot on the stick that the elites are trying to, keep us in line with this like constant threat. But when it comes to our current state of science, progress, technology, it's not moving in a progressive direction from the standard of what nature is considered progressive. It's moving in a very destructive sort of trajectory. We just don't recognize the destruction because of, I don't know, the bells and whistles that come along with it.
Yeah, the comfort level. The closer we get to just picking the fruit off the tree, the
Mm.
more kind of, sleep we get, the more we're able to just, let them paint a picture for us or pull the wool over our eyes for sure, I think. But, so I have a few things that I want to tease out from what you were saying. So, in the stuff that I've read about this and in your material, it seems like this would be around, I mean, not quite, but roughly 10,000 years ago?
Well, there's a couple of like geological dates that we can use. The biggest one I think that a lot of people know about now is the Younger Dryas event, which had something to do with a cataclysmic impact in conjunction with major climate changes. And I've had a couple of really great guests on my show that are way more experts in this than I am. So, a lot of what I wrote in my Substack article, I don't pretend to have like discovered it all. A lot of it comes from Michael LaFlemme, who's a great author who wrote Visions of Atlantis. And then just recently, 3 days ago, I spoke with filmmaker Jack Kelly, who put out a film which is titled The Atlantis Puzzle. So that episode's not released yet. It'll be out next week on my podcast, but he added a lot of information to my sort of hypothesis that I've been forming generally. But as far as like dates go, there's a couple of things that kind of pin me to this situation where, I didn't just think, oh, well, Atlantis is interesting. Let me learn more about it. What happened with me was I started learning about all these Tartaria theories, and I kind of was really skeptical. I'm like, these are like out of left field, and they're making really extreme claims. And I'm not here to debate or, say, oh, well, Tartaria is all wrong, because I don't think that. I'm very skeptical about a lot of the assertions that are being made about the history of our world and the timeline and such and so forth. So I said, well, where I live is 400 years old at least as far as records go, right? And then it's obviously way older than that, but the colonists have been here for 400 years. So let me just see what I can find, right? And I start looking around, I start digging, and sure enough, there are structures here in New England that are way older than that 400-year date, that timeline, and they're unexplained. They're not really, accounted for. And the accounts that are given of them are implausible at best. So when it comes to like this world that we live in, I quickly realize, wow, there's so much more out there just right in under my nose in this state that I grew up in. I never knew about all the stone walls, stone chambers, stone dolmens, standing stones, and not only, those, but megalithic stones. Some of these qualify as megalithic. And not only that, but they're astronomically aligned. So when you have these kind of astronomical sort of calculations being made, it's clearly done by somebody with advanced knowledge, right? And that kind of goes against the notions of what Native Americans were capable of as far as architecture. And when it comes to astronomy, if you can align a structure astronomically, well, then it stands to reason that you might be able to navigate the ocean using your knowledge of astronomy, right? Which is a big deal when you start to understand the whole Columbus myth and how they've tried to give us this kind of, well, it was the Bering Strait. Everybody came over the Bering Strait, these primitives. And until then, you know, it was just savagery going on here in North America and South America. And then Columbus came and he discovered all this stuff, right? Meanwhile, you have the great pyramids in Central America, you have the great Inca civilization, and as we already pointed out, we have the Amazon rainforest, which is kind of an anomaly and possibly evidence, or most likely evidence, of an advanced civilization. So, and the same is true up here in the northeast reaches of North America, where you'd think, oh yeah, no, it's just wilderness and colonial structures and maybe a couple of, you know, pits where wigwams used to be. But no, there's stones and all sorts of amazing structures. And I think it points at a huge gap in our understanding of the history of North America and South America. Now, I'm not saying that America is Atlantis or was Atlantis, but I think that if we're going to look at history, we do have some examples. Yes, and there's a picture of me on the, if you want to expand the picture, I don't know if that'll work for within Substack, but if you click on the top right corner of the photo, it might let you full screen the photo there. Yeah, there you go. So that's me standing in the shadow there,
Oh,
next to the
wow.
balanced rock
I didn't even
in
see
North
that.
Salem, New York. So I'm 6'8". So if I'm 6'8" and I'm standing next to that rock, I'm barely even half the height of that huge stone there. So, I mean, just conceive of that kind of project. Like, there are techniques, using, some clever tricks to where you could, possibly move a big stone like that. Or, if a big stone like that's already in place, you could maybe, dig underneath it, place some rocks underneath it, and then dig out all the remaining earth so that the
Mm,
rock is only standing on those rocks, right? So there are
that's a
techniques that
little
can be used
tricky.
to make these kind of structures.
Yeah. because the earth would
Right. I mean,
sink. I mean,
yeah, if you're gonna
you'd have to really
right.
build it up all the way,
You'd
maybe
have
even
to
right
use some
to
kind of
bedrock because it's
structures.
old, right? Yeah,
Yeah, very old. I mean, you'd have to have some kind of wooden struts to keep it up while you remove the earth and then place the stones underneath and then remove the struts. But yeah, there's
right.
definitely uh, a mystery here as to how these things were created. And when you look at what the geologists say, they'll just say, "Oh, well, these are glacial erratics. You know, the glaciers move so erratically that it throws stone randomly and you create these piles like that," right? Which again, like sure, maybe in some cases that could happen, but when people look around and see that there are many of these structures, it just kind of that explanation just doesn't hold up. And then also like something like a stone chamber just couldn't be built by a glacier. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just ridiculous.
What was that other picture that we were looking at? So there's the stone that you were standing
We
next
have
to.
7 yeah, there's 7 pictures there altogether. I didn't take all of them, I've taken a few of them, but those stone chambers are in the New England area and the New York and Pennsylvania areas, New Jersey as well. So they're all over the Northeast, and they happen for the most part to be aligned towards one direction. I'm gonna say west, but I could be wrong. But I think they're aligned all to the west, which is an indication that these are not just utilitarian structures. They have maybe a spiritual purpose, or at the very least, a calendric purpose. So if you have a fixed vantage point, you can use that fixed vantage point over time to make calculations on where the sun is, and then of course from that, understand what time of year it is to a very precise degree. And you need that if you're farming, if you're doing things like long distance travel, even if it's just over land. And on that note, there are these like cairns, which are essentially tall piles of stone that Glenn Kreisberg, who's an author who's written a really interesting book about this subject, um, and he's essentially plotted out a line of cairns that he believes was some sort of path that led people from the Long Island, New York, Connecticut area to what is now considered the Great Lakes, right? Well, in ancient times, people would have needed to go to the Great Lakes and then to the ocean, right? There's all sorts of different resources that you could be, trafficking in, trading in, rather. And there's tons of evidence to show global trade going on around the world more and more and more nowadays. Yeah, there it is, NERA. So that's the North or maybe the New England Archaeological Research Association, or it might be
Mm.
Northeast Archaeological Research Association. But they do some great work. They might not stand by all of my Atlantis claims. I think they tend to be very conservative with the claims that they're making, which I respect because they need to protect these sites and be as reputable with their opinions on them as possible, conforming to today's standards. But who knows? Maybe, the time will come where people are more open minded to the possibility of something like a European culture here alongside of the Native Americans, not and or, but alongside of the Native Americans prior to Columbus. There's political reasons why they don't want us to acknowledge that. There's groups of people in Canada who have European DNA that are considered Native American. So there's plenty of evidence for this. But when it comes to like some of the more strange things going on here is there also happens to be a lot of giant skeletons in association with these sites, as well as mounds, right? Which the mounds, that's a different topic that's related, but just not my specific area of expertise. Yeah, I saw the
Frightening
Etowah
me because,
Mound.
yeah, he's near them in Georgia, Etowah Indian Mounds.
Right, and there's tons of mounds all over the Midwest and the sort of East, I guess you could say, and even along the East Coast, but a lot of them have been destroyed, the ones that were once along the East Coast. Up my way, the soil is a little too oh, look at that. Yeah, so there have been giant skeletons found all over New England, but keep in mind, New England's one of the older portions of America to be colonized. So a lot of this stuff's been discovered in a time where they didn't have the internet and they probably weren't telling many people about these discoveries beyond the people that lived in their town. So unless it got reported in a newspaper of some kind, which a lot of them did, uh, it might be the case that there are thousands more of these anomalous types of archaeological sites that have either been lost to time because people aren't aware of what these are and then they destroy them or damage them in some way, or they're just, ignored and left to be kind of forgotten, right? So, but when it comes to the East Coast where I live, the soil is too stony and rocky to create giant mounds in most places. You could make mounds in certain places, but wouldn't be enough for the scale that they had in the Midwest, right?
But
So
the
you have
cairns
stone
seem like
structures out this way
an
because
alternative.
Right, exactly. These stone piles are certainly an alternative, and along the coastal areas, you would even have piles of shells that would take the place of burial mounds. So instead of earth, it would be a pile of shells and these weren't even considered historical. Like people would just see them as big trash piles and eventually throw them back in the ocean. And then eventually somebody realized like, oh, there's like skeletons and like Native American artifacts inside of these big shell piles. It's not just they weren't just like throwing all their food waste in one spot. It was an actual sacred sort of ceremonial construction, right? Like many of these stones and stone structures, they have a ceremonial or sacred context as well as a utilitarian purpose. It's not just one or the other, they're multifaceted. So you can use them to navigate, but you can also use them in these more subtle ways that we can get into with the whole dream walking conversation. But that's partly how I kind of stumbled into this topic because I would go out and explore and I started to think like, well, what's going on with these stone walls? What's going, because I would hear people talk about like interesting stuff with the Tartaria stuff. So I was going out and I'm looking for like old buildings like halfway buried in the mud. And I didn't find any of that, but I did find, stone walls and a lot of weird stone structures that, you know, don't have a lot of information about them. So there's a mystery here. And whether that connects to an ancient advanced civilization could be, but it could be that it's less ancient than we think, and maybe only a couple hundred years before Columbus, there were people in North America that we wouldn't think of as Native American. And that kind of fits with some of the Native American stories of big, tall, hairy, red-headed giants and this and that, which we know now plenty about Sasquatch and his alleged presence in the forest. So could it be that Sasquatch is somehow related to this whole equation? Maybe. But I'd like to think as a tall person myself that it's not totally far-fetched, that it could have just been a minor height difference that got over exaggerated over time to where some people who were just taller in stature and tended to be 6'5" on average rather than 5'5" on average. It could just be a differentiance like that. But when you see how these skeleton reports come of like 8, 9, 10 foot tall, it's like, are these just humans anymore, right? So there's plenty. I mean, I can go down a whole nother angle with like the skeletal analysis. I mean, but I don't want to go too far off on the tangents because I have a tendency to just keep talking.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting, but I just wanted to point out, like, I hadn't really thought about it this way before you mentioned it, that as colonizers, whatever, it disrupted these ancient tribes or civilizations or cultures, they if those people were still around, they would have said, like, "This is our ancient burial stuff, like, you can't mess with that," and I feel like I read there's this old was it Joseph, Chief Joseph that had this speech and I was about the last buffalo, something like that. And he said, all my children are scattered, who, if they're not dead, they've scattered up in those mountains. This civilization is over, and I weep for the, loss of everything that we have known. And as I read his speech, I felt that way for us. Like, I felt culturally, this, whatever's happening to us, what we were talking about earlier, mentioning about, I don't know if it was on air or off, but the the elites manufacturing a crisis. I think there could be a real crisis that includes them, but in any case, they are definitely trying to destroy our culture. They destroy Middle Eastern culture, and it's sacrilegious in many ways, because we have the same thing. We have mausoleums, we have burial grounds, we have holy places. That Catholic cemetery is holy ground, and they used to wouldn't you couldn't, I think it may even still be true, if you committed suicide, you couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery. Like, it's just considered sacred ground. And as they destroy our culture and our connection to the past, I can see how damaging that is spiritually to everybody, really. And so yeah, but let's connect this. I was reading one of uh you had several, I think a couple of people and many accounts of each person. One who channeled someone from the Atlantis era in the past, who, since we're talking
Yeah.
about the Americas and we're talking about Peru, who told that story about there was a robust agricultural civilization there. I remember it. It's gone now. And I wasn't totally clear on what that was. So it was somebody in, I think, in Kentucky or maybe out west, who
Yeah.
channeled
Oh, yeah,
someone
I
from,
can explain.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm noticing my connection might not be that clear,
Yeah.
so I apologize.
Yeah. That's right. If I
But
don't talk, it's not a problem.
okay, all right. Well, I'm just gonna give myself a nice pause so I don't interrupt you in between. But so yeah, Frederick Spencer Oliver is who you're mentioning there, and he grew up near Mount Shasta in the late 1800s. And what's interesting about him is a lot of people can read the material that he ended up writing and write it off and say, well, this is just like the type of stuff people were writing back then, fantasy, mystical nonsense. And, like, it's easy to write it off if you don't know his backstory and just say, oh, well, this guy was just trying to sell a fantastic story, right? Like, yeah, anyone with a rich imagination can maybe predict some things that'll actually come true without actually predicting them. They're just being imaginative, right? But then you learn about Frederick Spencer Oliver and you find out, well, he didn't ever want anyone to read what he wrote. He kind of ruined his life by writing this. Some kind of like channeled spirit took him over and basically used him as a author of autobiography. So this man named Philos the Theban, he claimed to have lived like something crazy, like 200,000 years prior to Frederick Spencer Oliver's existence, and he was using him to recall his past lives. And he had multiple lives that he described through Frederick. One that was a little closer to Frederick's lifetime, still very far away in the grand scheme of things, like maybe 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. So this being lived at the beginning and basically at the end of what this being called like a great advanced civilization with a similar name to what we now think of as Atlantis. It wasn't Atlantis, it was something like Atalan or something like this. Um, and yeah, so when it comes to the author, Frederick Spencer Oliver, he never wanted to publish this book. It was kind of like a psychic thing where automatically writing these thoughts that were flooding his mind, almost like a bout of schizophrenia or something, right? And I have the book. I read it a couple years ago, and I was a little bit confused by it until I found Michael LaFlemme's book, and he explains in detail like what's really going on there because he has the mind to kind of sort through it. And some of the account again, like Frederick Spencer Oliver never made any money from the book because he died before it was published. His mother was so distraught that her son died at such a young age that she took the papers and thought, well, if my son's not going to live a full life, I might as well let his work kind of live on, right? So that's how The Dweller on Two Planets was published. And that really cuts out any argument of like this guy was hoaxing or this guy was trying to make money because his mother really didn't make money off the book either, right? So that's the other side of it. It's like this isn't that you can't explain it away like that. So now that I've kind of given the disclaimer, let's get into some of the predictions. So, through this channeling, the being described a device called the Name, spelled NAIM, and it's essentially a smartphone. Everything they describe about it does what a smartphone we know today as what we know them to do today, aside from it was somehow more advanced in the sense that like what we would think of as a FaceTime call would be like holographically projected, almost like the movie Star Wars, where like they're talking to each other and you can see their holographic image on the table and vice versa, right? So that's described again in the late 1800s. This is not a kid who's reading sci-fi either. That's the other side of it. He didn't have access to really many books outside of maybe like the Bible and I don't know, some classical lit, but either way, no sci-fi. Um, they're describing an Ethernet system, like essentially what we would think of as Ethernet communication. So devices that are connected to each other over long distances through cables. Wireless energy is also described. Video surveillance is described. Monorail high speed transportation, speech to text transmission, weather manipulation technology. Like these are all technologies we understand today, but we don't really have full grasp of them. Electric rifles is exactly what they are called, and according to the description the author gives or the channeler gives, they're rifles that shoot lightning bolts. They have grand organs that use like sound healing frequencies. They have atmospheric water generators, so they don't need to, take water from the ground to drink. They have something called a book machine, which again, it might just be another way of describing what we think of now as a computer. But again, 19th century mind writing all this stuff. Uh, Criminal reform using a brain re-entertainment technology, MK Ultra, right? So very
Yeah,
strange stuff. And then as far as like revelation, go ahead.
sorry, Demolition Man is like and they're doing that. Like I've seen actual discussions of the
Right.
technology that they're kind of joking around in Demolition Man for reprogramming people inside their brain from being criminals.
Right. Well, and if you think about it on this predictive programming level, like I'm not necessarily buying that this channeler is being wholly truthful. I don't think the author is being disingenuous, but maybe this channeling being is like predictive programming in the 19th century,
Oh, time
like,
travel,
yeah, like
maybe
who
from the
knows?
forward back.
Yeah, getting real skeptical here. That could be the case. But some of the other things that kind of prove that this is more than just fiction. He describes things about the world that we now have validated through scientific research, such as the Amazon River basin was once a massive center for agricultural innovation. There were once massive mining operations in the Great Lakes. We know that now with all the missing copper ore in the Great Lakes region. Uh, they also said that, and again, keep in mind, 1800s, anthropology and archaeology were still very new, and the Inca had not been studied yet. Meanwhile, this channeler says that the people in his time called the sun Incal. The Inca had the same exact word for the sun. So again, this is possibly more than just channeling. Um, this guy says there's a ruined temple at the summit of Grand Tetons. You could now go to the Grand Tetons, and there's a site called the Enclosure, which is allegedly a temple that was destroyed with a major energy blast of some kind, whether that's lightning or or some of these airships that are described, which in the 1800s, there were a lot of rumors about airships. So that's not really that far fetched. But then when it comes to some things that could have only been found out in the modern times, um, Philos channels that the dry seabed, now known as Lake Bonneville, stretched across what's now Salt Lake City, Utah. Uh, they said it was once a massive body of water teeming with life. Well, scientists have proven that recently. That wasn't known information back in, this author's time. So, and then to another one, the Nazca lines. They weren't
Yeah,
discovered until
I've seen them.
1920, but they're described in this book. Oh, you've seen them personally?
Yeah, I in the on the
Wow.
in the plane, I was so afraid because it was this, like, a little prop plane, and I said, "We shouldn't go in this plane, these planes are scary," and not long after that, one of them did go down, but we just wanted to do it, and we
Well,
saw
guess
them.
what?
They're freaky.
You might not be that far. I don't know what you don't have to say what part of California you are in, but there is similar structures in California called the Blythe intaglios. So the proper term for the Nazca lines is intaglio. Anytime you have a structure that's meant to be seen from the sky like that, it's called an intaglio.
Oh,
So, and part of my thoughts with all these stone lines here in New England is, all right, so I'm gonna have to explain a meteorological thing for a second here, and then maybe this will start to make sense. So, the Earth as we know it today has like these two bands, right, that go along the atmospheric currents, right, like big bands of water. And underneath these bands is pretty much where like the major rainforests and forests of the world are. So these are like those monsoon zones where you have a lot of monsoons and things are overgrown, right? And where I am, it's not technically like a monsoon, but there's definitely a higher concentration of rainfall and water. It's just colder, so it comes down as snow, not only as just liquid precipitation, right? But these bands shift over time. So there was a point in time where that dry zone that is like the equator, where there's a lot of deserts, there's kind of like this strip around the earth of deserts that was once wet, and then there were dry zones in what we now think of as wet zones, right? So there was a time when New England could have been more of a rocky desert kind of landscape, and maybe that explains some of the stone wall features. I don't know. That's a very kind of off the top of my head kind of thought that I just had, but it connects to something Jack Kelly and I were talking about in relationship to his Atlantis puzzle movie, which his major the major point with that film, which is really fascinating, is that the Plato Atlantis story is actually a puzzle that's meant to be solved. It's not like a story that's meant to be just heard like any other story. Essentially like a challenge, like the way your teacher would give you like a story that has like some kind of coded message, and you have to figure out what that is, right? So uh I think there's a little bit of that in what we now think of as history. There's a lot more mystery than there is known history. And yeah, I don't know. I kind of got lost on the intaglio thing, but where were we
Yeah.
before that?
Well,
Before I didn't ask.
we were talking about the guy who, like from 2 planets, he was channeling that stuff and talking about some ancient stuff that was coming that explained kind of the history of the Amazon, but also talked about technologies that we couldn't that
Right.
mirror our own. And I'm wondering, with those technologies, is the idea, and I've heard this from other people, but I'm interested in your opinion and the research that you've done, that these ancient civilizations, lost civilizations, and there's no reason not to think there have been lost civilizations. When we're told that they are technologically advanced, and I think people are making this parallel to say that now we have this technological advancement, but if there is a cataclysm, we'll go back to the Stone Age and rise again. Do you think, or is it commonly accepted that those ancient civilizations did actually have technology as advanced as ours, maybe of a different nature, like maybe it was more telepathic or something? What's your opinion, and how does that fold in with your research on Atlantis?
Well, I'll say this first. The bar that academia gives us is very low. So academia tells us that we've evolved from apes and that technology has progressed in a linear fashion over time. So that being said, to say that like people in 100, 200,000 years time were doing things like calculating the stars and the sun's and the moon's movement and helping that, using that information to help with agriculture and, and navigation. That's advanced. It is important to keep in mind that when we're talking about advanced technology, there is a large range. We're not just talking about supercomputers and like mega weapons and things like that. It certainly seems like we're given stories and accounts of what we can now think of as technology. But because we went through a time period where our knowledge and understanding of technology was very little, uh, we've lost touch with that. So our understanding and our language has removed us from our initial understanding of these technologies. So I don't necessarily think that what we have today is the most advanced. You made the caveat about like, well, could it be psychic technology, right? Is our own mind technology at that point, right? Like what is technology at that point if we're interfacing, and hey, the boundaries that Elon Musk is exploring now with like Neuralink and whatnot, right? They're kind of in a very materialistic way trying to create this sort of psychic scenario. So, yeah, I do think that that was probably more possible in the past based on some things that I've talked to with a guy named Bibu Dev Misra. Parameters that our Earth is subject to in seasons. The same way our temperatures fluctuate based on what part of the Earth you're in, if you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, not every time of the year is the same temperature, right? It fluctuates. Well, the same is true for our cosmic seasons. And the energy quotient of the Earth changes over time. And you can track that in the size of organisms. Bibu's shown that the skull capacity of human beings 20,000 years ago was 20% larger, which could mean that I'm sorry, I'm saying 20,000, I mean 200,000. A lot
Yeah.
of twos there. But so 200,000 years ago, our cranial capacity was 20% larger, which means that our entire skeleton would have also been 20% larger because we weren't just like big-headed
Yeah, how
bobbleheads
could you
walking
hold your head
around.
up? It's hard enough as
Right.
it is.
Right. So that would be maybe an explanation for why there's all these giant skeletons buried in certain places in the earth, because as the earth changes and all the organisms around us also have this fluctuation. That's why we find things like massive megafauna in the fossil records as well. And there's this misconception that humans were tiny in comparison to these megafauna and we had to fight them. And I wonder if it wasn't that, there was some sort of giant cataclysm that knocked us out of our normal routines. And that's what led to this massive die off where we had to predate on megafauna because the initial cycle of life had been broken. And this is just something that happens on a periodic basis in on on
Ooh,
different
our connection is
scales.
definitely sketchy.
So you
Uh,
have these mound, but then you also have yeah. Did I break up there? Did you
a
hear
little bit,
everything I was
but I
just
think it
saying?
caught up again, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the intervals of this sort of cataclysm cycle can be tracked, and I think they happen to different degrees in a sort of periodic way. So we have big and little ones over these periods of time. And again, it's none of this is stuff that I've pulled out of my own head. This is all, things that I've researched and other authors and not I'm not an author, but authors and different researchers have kind of put these ideas forth. I'm just kind of culminating them for you guys here.
So when you talk about it, when you like the title of your post there was American Atlantis. So when we look at what Plato said, if it is a puzzle, and look at what the guy said who was channeling uh, and talking about the past and maybe future technology or past technology, is so the idea is that Atlantis was a genuine physical place. I mean, I read all the things in your post about different descriptions through the ages, even from India, and it seems to be that Atlantis was basically a huge island, if not an entire continent, that submerged under the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and just eventually kind of dissolved. But am I to understand that some people think it was America itself? Because there was one of your passages debunked that idea because it was too big. It's too big to be Atlantis.
Mhm. Well, I kind of have an evolving opinion on this because when I wrote this article, I didn't know everything I know now, but I do think that there is a land mass somewhere between what is now considered the Caribbean and what is now considered like the Sargasso Sea. So
Mm.
the Sargasso Sea is kind of an anomaly. It's like a place where the Atlantic Ocean becomes pretty shallow and there's a lot of seaweed plant life. And recently it's been piling up on the shores of Mexico. It's been a big issue. They're getting a lot of sargassum flowing. So I don't know why that is, but it could be that this isn't necessarily a natural situation where this sargassum is possibly growing there because there's again, an agricultural powerhouse underneath the water. So you have an overabundance of nutrition. So this sargassum is coming in, it's making up for that overabundance. It's changing, whatever it is, nitrogen into something else, doing its thing. There's so much of it in that one place is because something anomalous happened there in the past. And again, I'm not an expert on seaweed, so forget, but that might be some kind of evidence there, this really strange anomaly. And of course, this Sargasso Sea just happens to line up with the Bermuda Triangle, which, of course, we all know about the Bermuda Triangle. That's kind of like first grade conspiracy theory type stuff. One of my favorite conspiracy theories, and probably like the least understood conspiracy theory. Because, I mean, so many people know about it, but how many people have an explanation for what's going on there that actually makes any plausible sense. I mean, there's plenty of hypotheses, but I don't know if any of them have more proof than any other. So I'm not saying that this is like totally a sunken continent, but I think when you look at the whole situation with the cataclysms and different land masses maybe moving and shifting over time, it's possible. But then I talked to Jack Kelly, and he told me, based on their research, the sea levels really haven't moved enough to account for something like a sunken continent. So his sort of posit in this direction is, well, Africa, the Sahara Desert, maybe wasn't what we see it as today. Maybe there was an entire Great Lakes region there, which is actually, according to the Milankovitch cycles, there's something called like the 20,000 year green Sahara, which is like what I was describing before, where this dry zone that's in the around the equator of the earth, because of the shifts in the weather, becomes over precipitated for a long period of time. In a human lives perspective, it's something like a 5 to 10,000 year period. It seems like not a lot now in the grand scope of things, looking at the deserts, how huge they are. But to think that, something like the Great Lakes that we see in North America could have been in that massive region that is now the Sahara Desert in Africa. Maybe that explains how the pyramids got built, because they had these shipping lanes of rivers that no longer exist, and they could move, massive stones down the water from quarries that were far, far away. Like, we know how far away some of these stones came from. Well, if the whole, Africa was wet and full of water, then maybe we'd see that. And I love Africa. I've never been there. It's always fascinated me. One of the things that I really like remember loving to see as a kid when I'd watch those documentaries is how Africa changes every year with the rainy season and the dry season. It's something that, living where I live, I don't have a rainy season and a dry season. I have, winter, spring, summer, fall, right? Right. So I've always been really fascinated by that rainy, dry season, and how what is like a barren, kind of dry, almost half burnt like area becomes like this massive wetland, this marshland, and all these fish come out of nowhere and swim, in what half of the year is completely dry, like, to the point where a lot of these organisms have evolved special abilities to survive those dry conditions, right? So we have so much anomalous data here, and I think what we can maybe do is, from here, with the connection not being so good, I would recommend people go and check out the Atlantis puzzle for sure, if they want to hear more about all of that I was just describing. But part of that whole theory is that there was a great civilization that lived in that area, called the Atlantides, or the Atlanteans, and maybe their name was kind of lent to the Atlantic Ocean, in some way, because the Greeks, as they expanded, they would name things after the cultures that they interface with, right? So maybe that's how we got the name Atlantic Ocean, from these Atlantean people. Again, when I wrote that article, I didn't know what I know from this Atlantis puzzle. So you're kind of hearing me reconcile those two, some opposing viewpoints there. So who
Is
knows?
the
In a few months, I might change my mind on all this. But
Atlantis puzzle, is that a book? I'm looking at Visions of Atlantis by Michael Laflamme, who you were talking about earlier. Is the Atlantis puzzle, I know you were saying that's what people think Plato is, so I wanna refer people to that, and then I wanna start talking about the dream walking. So, what is the Atlantis puzzle, is it
yeah,
a book?
no, it's a film, and I
Right,
think
right,
you
okay,
can
by
even
Kelly,
just go to the atlantispuzzle.com. Jack Kelly,
right,
yeah.
Jack Kelly, right, okay, sorry, I
Yeah, and
forgot.
that's spelled with two E's. Kalley.
Oh,
But
I
no,
think
it's
that's the
fine.
Irish.
And yeah,
No, English, that's the
yep,
English
yep,
way.
yep. So,
Uh,
but yeah, Jack
yes,
Kelly,
cool.
Kelle.
Uh, okay, so yeah, so I'm gonna check that out. I mean, I greatly prefer to just kick back and absorb my information in like an hour and a half in front of a screen than reading the whole book, but I'm sure it's worthwhile to read the book as well. The Michael LaFlemme book seems to have been a wealth of information, and it's always better documented when you can read a book, you have all the footnotes at your fingertips. So they sound like both good resources. And it sounds like there's a lot of evidence
Yeah,
for some kind of ancient civilization, even in our direction. I mean, I always expect that stuff under Egypt or Mesopotamia or something, but not so much here. But
right.
I mean, sounds like there
Well,
could
and
be.
that's what I like to encourage people with the dream walking is like I had an approach to this kind of research that might seem unconventional or maybe like a little bit mystical, but it was just an acknowledgement that I don't know everything and that, the best way to get out and explore is to literally do that because there's so many barriers when it comes to the world of information technology, like podcasting is really a last bastion, and it's my favorite place to find like other information like the right, maybe authors and filmmakers and things like this, but when it comes to like discovering something like who you are and what you're interested in, dream walking is kind of a way to do that. So it might not be history that you're totally into, right? But dream walking is going to take you there. And what dream walking is essentially taking your dreaming consciousness and the way your dreaming consciousness would see reality through a dream and maybe applying some of those perspective cues to the way you see your world. And I guess a lot of this for me was inspired by a couple different things. I've always loved nature. I've always loved being spontaneous. And then there was this kind of app that came out a while ago called Randonautica, and it would digitally give people random coordinates, and they would travel to the coordinates, and sometimes they'd find really strange things. And there's a lot of creepy stories that came out about people being led to maybe like a crime scene kind of or just their sanity. And that concerned me. So I thought, well, you know, technology has this kind of, I don't know, potential to be manipulated. Who knows? Like maybe there's some kind of entities working through that app trying to mess with people, or maybe it's just, people being irresponsible with their I don't know, supernatural potential and not really understanding what's going on there. Because for me it sounded like Randonautica was kind of like gaming synchronicity, and I had noticed synchronicity in my own life, and it was pulling me towards what I'm doing now, what I was sort of meant to do in ways. I hope that doesn't sound like too arrogant, but I've always loved communicating. I've always been such like a strange type of person that people are just kind of like fascinated by me. You point out my height. That's a fascinating characteristic of mine. I don't follow traditional style conventions, even though my younger sister is very fashionable. She's a little fashionista. But yeah, me, I kind of, I dress the way I like to dress and whatnot. And I feel like, you know, my eccentricities aside, like there were some things that I could have done sooner in my life. And when I started to recognize those things, it started to spiral me towards a positive trajectory because I started becoming aware of these good qualities that I needed to nurture. Was a little bit of like like pressure to like make something of my life, right? Don't just be like a, just don't just like float through the wind and, you know, m- set your own course, right? And I think a lot of people, they get stuck in just trying to keep up with life, and they don't necessarily set their own course in a way that is fruitful. And sometimes stepping out of your routine is the easiest way to allow your subconscious or your dreaming consciousness to remind you of those inner higher qualities that you have, that you are actually meant to be here to express. Our life is so bogged down by our physical Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we forget that, like, one of those needs, the most important need at the top of the pyramid, is like the one that is about, your ideation of you, like who you are, what's your right, and that's at the top of the pyramid. It might not be the take up the most space on the pyramid, but if I'm remembering the hierarchy of needs correctly, that's like kind of the most important one, is like who you are and how you see yourself, right? So your dreaming mind and your consciousness, your subconsciousness, it's always trying to remind you of that. And for a lot of people, it causes a lot of pain. For me, it caused a lot of pain and a lot of shame, because I felt like I wasn't doing, and I was probably just too hard on myself because I was very, very young to be putting that much pressure on myself. But yeah, it caused a lot of shame. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't even acknowledge. They just get along to go along and go along to get along. And they have these like midlife crises where their whole life falls apart, and they get a divorce, and then maybe, God bless them, they find what they're truly passionate about. But why wait until it all falls apart? If you can just change up your routine now and start living your life the way you want to live it. Because we get into these routines, and something as simple as just going for a drive and going down a road you've never gone down before can unlock all these different thoughts, because we get set in these routines. So, to take it all back down to reality, don't use your phone, don't use Randonautica. Go to, I don't know, your closet and find like one of these old board games you never play anymore, and take the dice out of the board game and put them in your pocket, and then get a cup, because you're in your car, you're not going to be throwing dice around your car like a crazy person. So get a cup, and you, just like you play Yahtzee, roll the dice in the cup and see what you find. And you give yourself the parameters of, if I roll an odd number, I take a left turn. If I roll an even number, I take a right turn. Or you say, if I roll an odd number, I go to this town. If I roll an, even number, I go to this town, right? You give yourself these little like options by the randomness of the dice. And 9 out of 10 times when I would do this, these really amazing things that would occur would be really personal, and they'd connect me to what this higher ideal was that I was searching for. And when I used to talk about this stuff on podcasts, I would focus more on the personal side of it for me, which I think was harder for people to relate to than this way I'm talking about it now, which is more of an instructional. And I'm trying to tap into my ability to instruct rather than tell the story, because I can tell stories of like when I found this and that, and then this happened, that happened, this happened, and that's all really interesting, and I'm sure we could go down one of those stories if you'd like. But at the end of the day, I started to feel a little self-indulgent talking about those things, because it's not about that for the people listening. It's about their story that they're going to create when this inspiration hits them, to do this and change up their routine in a very mild and beneficial way, not in this crazy way. A lot of people, they go on a bender to change up their routine, or they do something really destructive, to change up their routine. And this is a really simple way you can use like chance, just a simple chance of whatever the dice are going to roll to to change up your routine in a really, and I'm telling you, for people listening to podcasts, they're already primed and ready to do this for themselves. And not everybody's going to need this. Some people are in a place in life where everything's good and they don't need to shake things up.
I definitely, I'm have a routine that's very chore oriented. I mean, I'm like a forever mom because my oldest son, who's probably just walking in the door now, he's 22, but he has Down syndrome. So like I'm always gonna be, making sandwiches and cleaning. It's all and it's fine with me. I'm fine with it. Always like my husband says every 5 years you have to reinvent yourself. So I always liked like we moved or he got a new job. I mean, not really intentionally, but it just he thinks it actually happens kind of automatically. And I've heard that your cells basically every 7 years you have almost no cells that you had 7 years ago that you actually do physically change over that time. And I try to remember one reason I do podcasting is that I feel like it's such an interesting way to grow and expose yourself to the world and to have to stay relevant and engaged. And I even do it in part because my husband's out in the world and I am like the grilled cheese making machine. Like, how interesting is that going to be to come home to every night? So I try to keep it interesting. But so but all of that stuff I can get my mind around. And I'm just going to tell you one like experience that blew my mind. And I don't know if other people have had this and if there are other things that I didn't even know were like this, but I was in New England and somebody I know a few people up there. I used to know more because I lived up in New York and everything, but a few people who had boats. So in New York, they don't really have boats. I don't know anybody with boats, but in New England, like normal people have boats. And one time somebody who had like it was a motorboat that you'd normally have on a lake.
It's funny you say that because I have a boat in my trunk that's inflatable, and I also have a shirt on that has a boat on the back. So it's just weird, and I'm in New England,
Yeah,
so I'm
where
like totally cliche right now.
you're gonna get it. You're gonna understand what I'm saying. So one time I was in the boat that I'd been in before in the lake. For some reason, it was in a harbor. I guess he had it on a trailer. It was a long, long time ago. And he said, "You want to go out on the boat?" And I said, "Sure." So I got in the boat, and in the harbor, the boat was very small and the other boats were super huge. And to get out like into a bay, you all have like bays and then you have oceans, but the bay is ocean water but the bay is calm, but the ocean is scary. And he was kind of a, you know, hot rodder, like he's a motorhead. And he was just like, "Hey, let's go." And we were going, and the experience of being in the water, which is freaky, and the boats being huge, I think for days I kind of had actual dreams about it and stuff. It rocked my world. And I thought, what else is there that's, gonna that people think is ordinary that would rock my world? I froze
Yeah,
Mark.
I love that. I love that. No, I know. I'm keeping up. I'm a pro.
But your
I know how it
Wi-Fi
works,
froze, I
but
think. I think your Wi-Fi got shocked by but I mean, it seems so ordinary, but it freaked me out.
I love now I really lost you. I thought I was a pro, but now I lost you.
You're
All
back.
right. I think now we're back. Okay. But yeah. Okay. Yeah. What I was saying though was, something as simple as just doing something. Yeah. That's a big way to reinvigorate this kind of dreaming consciousness that we all have in us. And I think, for the most part, our culture doesn't really like take dreams all that seriously, but some people do. There's like the whole notion of like you have a dream that thing, and then, it's like a forewarning or foreshadows somehow something that's going to happen in your future. But I think it can work in the reverse too, where you have a dream that helps you. You need to really, but yeah, when it comes to your dreaming consciousness, it's funny, you know, something as simple as a daydream can really help in many ways with a lot. I think we're so conditioned by like television and our lifestyles to not just take a moment to like breathe, you know? And it would happen to me a lot with like podcasts where I'd listen to a podcast and then it would end. And then I'd have to think for a moment, like, well, what am I going to do next? Am I going to listen to another podcast? And if so, what am I going to listen to? But I'd still be driving and so I would just kind of have a moment to pause. And then sometimes in those moments, I'd have the best ideas ever, and that's when I was like, all right, I really need a podcast. This was before I had my podcast. And I was like, I really need a podcast because I'd get all these great ideas while I was driving. I don't know what it is about driving. For me, that's a big part of it. So the dream walking can happen if you're like me and you like driving. It can happen behind the wheel, can happen behind the wheel of a boat, but it can also happen just walking or bike riding. It doesn't You don't have to own a car or know how to drive to participate in this. Because really dream walking is about getting out of your ordinary consciousness. That's all it is. We have an ordinary consciousness and we have a non-ordinary consciousness. And moments like what you described, where you do something new or something exciting, they tend to take us out of ordinary consciousness and put us into non-ordinary consciousness. And that's why you get such a thrill. Maybe you go on a roller coaster or something. That's like a good example of like a real thrill. Again, non-ordinary consciousness is going on there because your body is trying to make this really fast speed and like the danger of this situation, and you're calculating it on this subconscious realm, but your conscious mind's like, no, it's fine, this is fun, right? So um there's so many instances or examples of this, but I would just encourage people, like, if you like to go for a walk or something, think about how you already maybe go on a certain track and change it up, just change it up, if it's that simple. Or if you're somebody who doesn't get out much, plan a weekend out and go somewhere. Like, a lot of people have this conception that, oh, you need to go somewhere exotic to have a vacation. I'm telling you, you can drive 30 minutes from where you live and have the greatest experience, and it doesn't matter where you live, because anywhere on the earth have these places that you can find that are really just, I don't know, they'll take you into a new world, I think.
That's funny that you should mention the driving because I come from a long line of truckers. And my father, who really
Okay.
had that, he had that wanderlust. So he was from Brooklyn. He did not like the city. I grew up in Rockland County. And then when he had his midlife crisis, he was like a iron worker, welder. Before that, he had a butcher shop. But in his later years, he had always wanted to be a truck driver. So even though he was kind of too old to do it because he furniture moving was the only thing that could really make you any good money, and he's just a little too old for that. But when I was a teenager, because I was the youngest, so I was the only one who was kind of still left, he would be on the road all the time. So in the summers, I would tag along with him. And I remember, and then all you're doing is driving. There is nothing else. And you're not rolling dice. You're going from one place to another. But we would just drive all day, every day. And I remember how really cool it was. Two things. One, I just remember one of the places we were going was Salina, Kansas. And I was thinking, I've never heard of this place before. Like, what's Salina, Kansas like? I'm sure it was just a very, very small town because I never heard of it before or since. I mean, I guess I've heard of it occasionally, but it was still totally fascinating to me. And the other thing, and that's just the way all these places were, it would be army bases and stuff, which now you'd be like, yeah, it's an army base. How interesting can that be? But it's totally fascinating to a kid from, the Brooklyn Rockland continuum. And then the other thing is at night, late at night, we'd pull into the truck stops, and the truck stops are a totally different experience. There's just dozens of trucks, and if it's in the summer, which it always was, they'd be idling because a lot of them would keep the air conditioning on. You would sleep in the truck. So my dad would sleep in the sleeper, and I'd sleep in the doghouse, which would be the engines between the two seats, and you put a pillow on the driver's seat and a pillow on the passenger seat, and that's the bed for the, whatever, the navigator. The driver has to sleep in the actual sleeper because he's got to stay awake for 12 hours. And it would be you just all the engines, and you'd have to go in to take a shower, go to the bathroom or whatever. And it was like, it was like being in a forest, like in a kelp forest. And it seems so ordinary, but nothing was more transformational in my mind than the couple of summers I spent on the road.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't done much like long distance travel like that, but the few times I have, it's been a ton of fun. And I really once I get a car that's more reliable than the one I have now, I'll probably plan something like that. But
Well, I
to just
recommend
American culture that lends to that, like go ahead.
a truck stop
Yeah.
on that journey. If you take a journey like that, a long distance thing, make sure that you get the truck stop experience, because those are that's about as American as they're the modern cowboys.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, it's funny because I grew up, like, down the road from me where I grew up is Interstate 95, and there's a big truck stop there, but it's like a truck stop in a suburb, so it's not like there's nothing really adventurous about it. It's just kind of a hub for, like, seedy individuals and, some cruddy looking motels and all that, but no, I definitely see the appeal. Like, when I drove out to Denver, Colorado, we stopped at some truck stops, and it was interesting for sure.
Well, I was too young to recognize probably
Yeah, yeah,
prostitution and stuff, and I realized that was there now, but I would never know what that was. Like, uh,
right.
I mean, even when I would see sex on TV, I was raised like you just didn't have sex before you were married. So I would see like two unmarried people go into a room, and my father would say, That's terrible. And I'd be like, What do you mean? It's like, well, you know what they're doing.
Yeah,
I'm like, do you think that this is a movie? I'm watching a movie, and I just
yeah,
couldn't get my mind around what was being
right.
implied. So
I'm the
there's
same
no
way.
way. Yeah, I would have recognized a
Yeah,
prostitute at a
I'm
truck stop.
I'm the same way almost even now to detriment because I'm Catholic too, so of oh no, don't talk about it, So yeah, yeah, for sure. That's funny. I would have been the same way as a kid too, but I'm sure your dad had a close eye on you and didn't let you get near any crazy action. But I'm sure that too, like like I don't know, like the Midwest truck stops have a different vibe than the East Coast truck stops. I'll just say that. Like, the East Coast
Yes.
truck stops seem like there's a lot of drug dealing going on,
Actually,
than
my
prostitution.
my my brother was arrested. One of my brothers was a truck driver. He was arrested in a truck stop because he was, I don't know, somebody opened a package that had his name on it. He didn't
Uh-oh.
have the package, but somebody opened the package and put him in jail for 6 months for what was in the package.
Oh my
But
god.
yeah, he was a truck driver, but you can whatever, get yourself into trouble. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that perspective, yes, and I was actually in Georgia. He was in jail for 6 months in Georgia. Boy,
Wow.
that was a tough penalty for whatever it was he was allegedly up to. But yes, there are seedy places now that you mention it, but that's so funny. The perspective, I mean, there you go. So that's a perspective that depending on your place in life, you're going to see something totally different out there. Like that little boat in the harbor. If I was on a big boat, it wouldn't have freaked me out at all. I've been on ferries that doesn't freak me out. So some of it is your perspective, and if you and maybe what you're talking about is a
Mm-mm.
way to re-access some of the childlike wonder. They say the reason childhood years go by more slowly is that everything you experience is totally new and unexpected, and then you just have that moment. So the moments where it's not routine are so much more frequent, and that makes you feel like you're living more. Maybe your way of rolling dice, literally rolling dice and not knowing what's around the next corner, is a way to recapture some of that, because I kind of miss that. I feel like things were, although they were much scarier back then, they were certainly more exciting and engaging. And, the wow factor was much greater.
Right. Well, and yeah, I definitely recommend people be responsible and safe and, not, roll the dice with their safety. But yeah, you're describing exactly what I felt when I kind of stumbled upon what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, because it was just kind of driving around and observing what I had already witnessed my whole life without thinking, because if I was in the car with my mom or dad, like I wasn't like studying everything out the window necessarily. Sometimes I was in that mood, but most of the time I'd have my Game Boy or a book or whatever, and just have my head down. So, yeah, it just kind of re reinvigorated my love for where I'm from. Like being from this area, it's just yeah, getting out and seeing it myself kind of allowed for this discovery. And I think whether people are into history or not, or they, whatever they're interested in, that's what they're going to discover, because you create your own reality. That's why this is something that applies for more than just me. It's something anyone can do, especially people, like I say, especially people who listen to podcasts, because these are the folks that are aware and in tune and are ready for this kind of positive change, and I used to be that kind of guy who would just listen to podcasts at work and wish I was doing something differently, and now I am. So take it from me, it is possible, and funny enough, like I work for someone who I'm a huge fan of. Like I love Sam Tripoli. He's hilarious, and it's like, what kind of twist of fate where like you end up working for somebody that you love, and it's you just quit your job, and then next thing you know you're working for somebody, and I'm not saying like, oh, anyone's that's going to happen for everybody who tries this, but something like that will happen to you, and it's going to be particular to what your life is like, not don't look for my life, this just happened to happen to me, but something amazing, probably even better, possibly
I
could
I
happen
don't
to
want to
you. So take my advice and roll the dice. Look at
I don't
that.
want to keep you forever. I want to read this comment, and I just want to respond to that with my own experience. When I was growing up, it never even occurred to me that you could do more than one thing, that you could have more than one job, have more than one career. I became an investment banker because I was just kind of desperately poor, and I just never wanted to have money troubles, and never in a million years. And I thought, I can't have kids until I have a lot of money in the bank because I'll never be able to work again. And I ended up having a kid with Down syndrome, and I just kind of like, there was definitely no more working after that. And somebody who I met, a radio producer, and she just thought it was interesting to talk to me, and she gave me this job on the radio, and I had never any expectations of that. But even more weird is I just never expected to do anything else or anything different. I was going to kind of try to go back into banking. So, yeah, just being open, and don't expecting nothing to happen is probably not accurate, and might, except for to the extent it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I want to read this article, this comment by Frightening Me. Tinfoil Hat is a favorite show. I can't imagine how much Mark has to digest to vet and find these guests. Cheers to you, Mark, for that. And as for me, I know that right around the corner from me in this new house we have, new old house, are a couple of waterfalls that just maybe a mile away I can take a little hike. Even my Downs kennel can walk with me. They're such easy hikes, and you get to waterfalls. So maybe just expanding my horizon like that and seeing the Blythe intaglios. You've given me a lot here, even though I live in what I consider to be basically a cultural and physical desert. Not like New England. Maybe you're giving me ways to expand my mind right out my front door.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, and definitely take your son along with you. I think that's awesome to include him, and yeah, who knows, maybe he could help with the randomness, you know? They say people with certain, spectrums, you know, they could be facilitators of this energy sometimes, you know? They're tapped into something else, you know, on a different level.
That is a very good point. That could be why I never ever get bored. But how about you? I'm sure you never get bored, not only with rolling your dice, but with all the things that you have going on. So if you wouldn't mind, please tell the people where they can get more of you. They know
Oh.
you from Tinfoil Hat and from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, but you've got other coals in the fire.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Monica. This has been so much fun. We've managed, despite the little hiccup with the connection. I think it's other than that, it's been always a fun and amazing conversation with you. You bring out a good side of me, and it's always cool to talk to you because you have this like New York like cool that like I grew up around that. Like all my buddies like moved to the suburbs from New York, so like I grew up around people like you, and I appreciate your cadence. But yeah, no, my family thinks I'm crazy.com, and you can find Scene, which is the article essentially that I've put together, and it'll help you understand a little bit more about the dream walking stuff. And it's a PDF, so you just download it onto your phone, and you can read it like a, you know, like a ebook, I guess. But yeah, it's not a full book. It's only like 16 pages, and you'll also be supporting my podcast by doing so. And yeah, it's on my website. Then of course, podcast. It's available wherever you listen to the Monica Perez show, and we're on my Instagram at My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. That's like the best place to get in touch with me if you want to send me a message or send me some kind of suggestion for a book to read or a guest to have on Tinfoil Hat or on my show. Feel free to send that there because that's where I'm the most responsive. I do have a profile on X, but I'm more responsive on Instagram. So follow me there. And Monica, thank you so much. It's always great talking to you. Again, like I say, actually, to be more specific, you reminded me of my mom's friend Adeline, who grew up in the Bronx. So it's always nice to
Adeline,
shout out
we
to
had an
Adeline.
Adeline. Addie,
You might know her. Yeah,
does she make a
she's
great
a
rice pudding?
I I don't know about that, but she's a boss. And yeah, Adeline, shout out to you. She actually listens to my podcast, so I'll tell her to listen to your show too. But
Yes.
yeah, anyways, thank you, Monica. It's always good talking to you.
Super cool. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to wait, Mark, just because I want to upload your end of this. We're going to need two separate feeds, I think, to make it sound perfect in our podcasting feeds. Thank you all for hanging out, for chatting, for commenting. And thank you very much, Mark, for spending the beginning of your weekend with us. Thank you, everyone.